Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
My most embarrassing, bless you. Have you ever wondered if two tiny words could quietly decide whether you feel like an outsider or someone who truly belongs? That question stayed with me for much longer than I ever expected. If you've ever felt nervous before speaking English, worried that one small mistake would make everyone notice you, or believed you needed perfect grammar before opening your mouth, this story may surprise you. Today I'm sharing one of the most embarrassing moments of my married life in the United States, a moment that made my face turn bright red, made my heart race, and unexpectedly taught me one of the most important lessons about love, family, kindness, and everyday American culture. By the end of the story, you may never hear the phrase, bless you, the same way again. I never imagined that one of the shortest English expressions could become one of the biggest emotional memories of my life. It wasn't a business meeting. It wasn't a job interview. It wasn't even an important ceremony. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon inside my own home, surrounded by the people who loved me the most. That is exactly why it felt so unforgettable. My name doesn't really matter today because this story could belong to anyone trying to understand another culture while building a happy family. I'm a wife. I'm a mother. My life now is peaceful, busy, and full of ordinary moments that somehow become extraordinary when I look back at them. Like many families in America, our weekends are simple. We cook together, laugh together, argue over whose turn it is to wash the dishes, and somehow end every evening with everyone standing in the kitchen talking longer than anyone planned. That Sunday felt exactly like that. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house. Fresh bread was cooling on the counter. My children were laughing about something that seemed incredibly important to them, but impossible for adults to understand. My husband was setting the table while quietly singing along with an old country song playing from the speaker. Everything felt comfortable. Everything felt safe. Then something incredibly small happened. Someone sneezed. I froze. If you've lived in the United States for a while, you already know what usually comes next. Someone says, bless you. Simple. Automatic. Almost invisible. But for me, in that tiny second, my brain somehow forgot everything. I knew the phrase. I had heard it hundreds of times. I had practiced listening to it while watching movies. I had even repeated it aloud during my English practice. Yet when real life arrived, my confidence completely disappeared. Instead of speaking naturally, I hesitated. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The silence suddenly felt much louder than the sneeze itself. Then I finally opened my mouth. Unfortunately, I said the wrong thing. I'm not going to tell you exactly what came out just yet, because that embarrassing moment changed the direction of the entire afternoon, and you'll understand it much better as this story continues. What surprised me wasn't my mistake. It was everyone's reaction. Nobody laughed at me. Nobody corrected me immediately. Nobody made me feel foolish. Instead, something much quieter happened. They smiled. Not because I had spoken perfect English. Not because I understood every cultural rule. But because they could see I genuinely cared. That tiny difference would slowly change the way I thought about communication forever. Many people believe learning English is mostly about vocabulary, grammar, or pronunciation. Those things certainly matter. But psychologists who study language learning have found something interesting. Anxiety can temporarily reduce our ability to remember words we already know. In other words, your brain isn't empty when you panic. Your brain is simply too busy worrying about failure to find information that is already there. Looking back, that's exactly what happened to me. I didn't forget English. Fear borrowed my attention. Have you ever walked into a room and forgotten why you went there? A few seconds later, the answer suddenly returns. Your memory didn't disappear. your attention simply wandered. Speaking another language often works the same way. That realization made me kinder to myself. It also changed the way I practiced English. Instead of chasing perfect sentences, I started paying attention to real moments. A child laughing, neighbors waving, someone holding a door, a cashier wishing customers a nice day, parents cheering at a soccer game, friends saying, "Drive safe," family saying, "Take care," and yes, people saying, "Bless you." Those tiny expressions are everywhere in American daily life. They don't usually start deep conversations. They don't require advanced grammar, but they quietly build trust. They remind people that someone noticed them. Someone cared. Someone was paying attention. That Sunday, I didn't fully understand that yet. All I knew was that my heart was beating faster than it should over two simple words. It sounds almost funny now. But maybe you've experienced something similar. Perhaps you've spent 10 minutes preparing one sentence before ordering coffee. Maybe you've replayed a conversation in your head all evening because you wished you had answered differently. Maybe you've stayed silent, not because you had nothing to say, but because you were afraid of saying it imperfectly. If that's you, I want you to keep listening, because this isn't really a story about bless you. It's a story about belonging, about family, about discovering that kindness often speaks louder than flawless English, and about realizing that sometimes the smallest moments become the ones we carry forever. When people think about cultural differences in the United States, they often imagine holidays, food, politics, or famous landmarks. But the biggest differences are usually invisible. They're hidden inside everyday habits. The little phrases people say without thinking. The smiles exchanged between strangers. The unwritten rules that nobody explains because everyone assumes everyone else already knows them. Until someone doesn't. That someone was me. And strangely enough, I'm grateful it happened. Because if I had never embarrassed myself over those two tiny words, I might never have learned what they were truly teaching me. The lesson had almost nothing to do with English. It had everything to do with seeing another person, even for just a second. That ordinary Sunday would eventually become one of the happiest memories of my marriage, not because everything went perfectly, but because everything went honestly. And believe me, what happened after I finally said those unforgettable words was something I never could have predicted. The quiet rules nobody explains. If someone had handed me a list called The Invisible Social Rules Every Family in America Already Knows, I probably would have laughed. I spoke enough English to understand conversations. I could order food, chat with neighbors, help my children with homework, and follow movies without reading every subtitle. I thought I understood American life. What I didn't understand was something much quieter. The words people used were only half the conversation. The rest lived inside tiny habits, facial expressions, timing, and everyday kindness that nobody ever stopped to explain. And after what happened with my unforgettable bless you moment, I became obsessed with noticing those invisible details. I wasn't trying to become someone else. I simply wanted to understand why ordinary conversations sometimes made people feel welcome, while other conversations using exactly the same English words felt strangely distant. The morning after that embarrassing family dinner, I found myself replaying every second in my mind while making breakfast. My husband walked into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, smiled at me, and said, "You're thinking about yesterday again, aren't you?" I laughed because he was absolutely right. Somehow, two little words had occupied more space in my head than they deserved. Or maybe they deserved exactly that much space because they had exposed something I didn't even realize I was missing. Did everyone notice how awkward I was? I asked. He looked genuinely confused. Honestly, he replied. The only thing everyone noticed was that you cared enough to try. That answer surprised me. I expected him to explain grammar or pronunciation. Instead, he talked about intention. Around here, he continued, people usually remember how you make them feel much longer than the exact words you choose. That sentence stayed with me far longer than any English lesson ever had. Over the following weeks, I quietly became an observer. It almost felt like I was collecting clues in a mystery that nobody else realized existed. At the grocery store, I noticed strangers smiling at each other in the produce aisle. When someone's shopping cart accidentally blocked the way, nobody sounded angry. They simply said, "Excuse me," followed immediately by "You're fine," even when the situation wasn't anyone's fault. At my children's school, parents thanked volunteers repeatedly, even for very small favors. At the pharmacy, customers often wish the cashier, "Have a good one," before walking away. None of these phrases were difficult English. In fact, most of them appeared in beginner vocabulary lists. Yet hearing them in real life felt completely different from memorizing them in a textbook. The language wasn't carrying information. It was carrying warmth. One afternoon, something happened that made me notice another invisible rule. I was standing in line at a neighborhood bakery when the elderly gentleman in front of me dropped a few coins. Before I could bend down, 3 different people reached for them at the same time. Nobody hesitated. Nobody waited for someone else to help. After he thanked everyone, one woman smiled and simply said, "We've all been there." That sentence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't poetic. But it instantly removed the man's embarrassment. Later that evening, I realized something important. In many American communities, small everyday phrases often serve a much bigger purpose. They protect another person's dignity. That realization changed how I listened to conversations forever. Researchers in social psychology have found that tiny positive interactions, even those lasting only a few seconds, can strengthen trust, reduce stress, and improve our sense of belonging. Some scientists even call these moments microconnections. They may seem insignificant on their own, but over weeks, months, and years, they quietly shape relationships. Looking back, I realized my family wasn't welcoming me because my English had become perfect. They were welcoming me because I kept showing up with kindness, curiosity, and respect. Language was only one piece of that puzzle. That understanding also changed the way I practiced English. Instead of forcing myself to memorize hundreds of random expressions, I began paying attention to situations. What do people say when someone sneezes? What do neighbors say before leaving? What do parents say while watching children play? What does a cashier usually say after handing back a receipt? Suddenly, English stopped feeling like a school subject. It became something alive. Every trip to the supermarket became listening practice. Every family dinner became reading people's emotions. Every walk through the neighborhood became speaking practice without feeling like practice at all. One Saturday, my daughter sneezed while we were planting flowers in the backyard. Before I even had time to think, I smiled and naturally said, "Bless you." The words came out effortlessly.
No panique. No hesitation.
My daughter smiled back without even noticing anything unusual had happened. For her, it was just another ordinary moment. For me, it felt strangely emotional. A phrase that once made me freeze had quietly become part of my daily life. It wasn't because I had repeated it 1,000 times in front of a mirror. It happened because I had finally connected the words with genuine care instead of fear. That evening, I asked my husband a question I had never considered before. Do Americans always expect people to say, "Bless you"? He smiled and shook his head.
Not always, he answered.
Some people say it. Some people don't. It depends on the family, the region, the situation. But when someone says it sincerely, it usually feels thoughtful. His answer reminded me of something incredibly important. Culture is rarely about strict rules. More often, it's about shared habits shaped by kindness, history, and community. Understanding that difference removed an invisible weight from my shoulders. Since then, I've stopped measuring my English by how many advanced words I know. Instead, I ask myself a different question. Did my words make someone feel comfortable? Did they make someone smile? Did they show respect? Ironically, asking those questions has improved my English far more than chasing perfection ever did. Now, whenever I hear someone sneeze, I don't immediately think about vocabulary anymore. I remember that awkward family dinner. I remember my racing heartbeat. I remember believing everyone was judging me when, in reality, they were quietly cheering me on. And most of all, I remember discovering that the strongest connections are often built with the smallest expressions. But I still hadn't learned the most surprising lesson of all. Because a few days later, during another ordinary family dinner, one unexpected moment would reveal the real reason my first mistake mattered so much, and it had nothing to do with saying, "bless you," correctly. One awkward family dinner. There is an old saying that families don't really know you until they see how you handle an awkward moment. I didn't believe that until one ordinary dinner almost convinced me I had completely embarrassed myself in front of everyone I loved. Looking back now, I smile whenever I remember it. At the time, though, I was certain I had failed one of those invisible American social tests that nobody ever tells you about. The strange part is this. The mistake wasn't actually the most important thing that happened that evening. What happened after the silence was far more powerful, and it quietly changed the way I viewed my marriage, my family, and even my confidence in speaking English. If you've ever replayed an embarrassing conversation in your mind for days, wondering whether everyone else remembered it too, this part of my story may surprise you. A week after my unforgettable "bless you" moment, our family gathered again for Sunday dinner. We have a tradition in our house. Every Sunday, phones stay off the table. The television stays silent. We eat slowly, tell stories from the week, laugh about little mistakes, and somehow spend twice as long talking as we do eating. It's one of my favorite parts of family life because it reminds me that the happiest homes are often built through ordinary conversations instead of extraordinary events. That evening, everything felt relaxed. My husband had grilled chicken outside while our children argued over which homemade dessert tasted better. The kitchen smelled like fresh herbs, warm bread, and cinnamon. My mother-in-law was telling a funny story about getting lost inside a huge home improvement store because she refused to ask anyone for directions. Everyone laughed. Even she laughed the hardest. Then my father-in-law sneezed. Every head turned toward him for less than a second. Without thinking, my husband smiled and said, "Bless you." Almost at the same moment, my daughter repeated it. Then my son did too. The room suddenly became quiet. Not because anything was wrong, because everyone naturally waited for my father-in-law to smile before continuing the conversation. I noticed something I had completely missed before. Nobody rushed. Nobody interrupted. Nobody tried to become the loudest person in the room. It was a tiny pause filled with kindness instead of awkwardness. Without realizing it, I found myself smiling too. This time, I softly said, "Bless you." The words came naturally.
No panique.
No fear. No rehearsing inside my head. Just two simple words. My father-in-law smiled warmly and answered, "Thank you." That should have been the end of the moment. Instead, something unexpected happened. He looked at me for a second longer than usual and quietly said, "You know, last week wasn't embarrassing." I blinked. Before I could answer, everyone at the table suddenly looked at me. My face immediately became warm. Was everyone really about to talk about my most embarrassing moment? Apparently, yes, but not in the way I expected. I remember when I mixed up two completely different words while visiting another country, my mother-in-law admitted with a laugh. I once introduced myself using the wrong person's name during an important meeting, my husband added. My sister-in-law laughed so hard, she nearly spilled her drink before confessing she had once thanked a waiter after he accidentally bumped into her. Within seconds, the dinner table transformed into something completely unexpected. Instead of discussing my mistake, everyone started sharing their own. For the next 20 minutes, our family competed to tell the most embarrassing story. Wrong names, wrong directions, wrong greetings, misheard jokes, forgotten birthdays, text messages sent to the wrong person. The more stories I heard, the more one surprising truth became obvious. Confident people aren't confident because they never make mistakes. They're confident because they've learned that mistakes rarely become the disasters our anxious minds imagine. Psychologists sometimes call this the spotlight effect. Research suggests that people tend to believe others notice and remember their mistakes far more than they actually do. In reality, everyone is usually too busy thinking about their own lives to spend much time analyzing yours. That idea suddenly explained my entire week. While I had been replaying my awkward moment over and over, everyone else had already moved on. Even more surprising, they had never judged me in the first place. My husband looked at me and smiled. "Can I tell you what I actually remember?" he asked. I nodded.
I don't remember the words you said.
I frowned.
What?
I remember your expression. My expression? You looked worried because you wanted to show respect. His answer completely caught me off guard. He continued, "That's what people remember. Not perfect English. Not perfect timing. Not perfect pronunciation. Respect. Kindness. Effort." Those 3 words somehow carried more weight than every grammar lesson I had ever studied. That conversation stayed with me long after dinner ended. Later that evening, while washing dishes together, I asked my husband something I had quietly wondered for months. Do people ever get tired of saying little expressions like "bless you," "take care," or "have a good one" every day?
He laughed. No.
Why not? Because they're not really about the words. I looked at him, waiting. They're reminders. Reminders of what? That someone noticed another human being. His answer sounded so simple, yet somehow it explained so much about everyday life. In many American communities, those little phrases aren't formal rules. They're tiny moments of acknowledgement. Someone sneezed. Someone is leaving. Someone looks tired. Someone needs encouragement. The words themselves are small. The attention behind them is much bigger. That night, after everyone went home and the house finally became quiet, I sat by the living room window thinking about something unexpected. For years, I believed becoming fluent meant speaking longer sentences, using advanced vocabulary, sounding more impressive. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe real communication starts somewhere much smaller. Maybe belonging begins the moment another person feels seen. Not because your English is perfect, but because your kindness feels real. The next morning, while walking through our neighborhood, I noticed things I had ignored before. A jogger waved at an older couple. A delivery driver thanked someone for holding a gate open. 2 neighbors spent almost 5 minutes talking about absolutely nothing important. Weather, gardening, weekend plans. Yet both walked away smiling. None of those conversations would ever appear in an English textbook. None sounded particularly advanced. But every single one quietly strengthened human connection. That realization changed the way I listened forever. From then on, I stopped asking, "What's the difficult vocabulary here?" Instead, I asked, how does this conversation make people feel? Oddly enough, my listening skills improved much faster after that, because I wasn't only hearing English anymore. I was hearing relationships. Still, one mystery remained. Why had such a tiny expression affected me so deeply? The answer wouldn't come from another family dinner. It would arrive somewhere much more ordinary. During a simple conversation that completely changed how I understood the phrase, bless you, and why millions of Americans continue saying it every single day without even thinking about it. Why Americans say, bless you. What if I told you that millions of Americans say, bless you, every single day without stopping to think about where it came from, yet the real reason people keep saying it today has almost nothing to do with history? That question followed me for weeks after my awkward family dinner. I had finally become comfortable saying the phrase, but another mystery refused to leave my mind. Why did two simple words survive for hundreds of years? Why did complete strangers say them to each other in grocery stores, schools, airports, parks, doctors' offices, and neighborhood cafes? Was everyone simply following tradition, or was something much deeper happening beneath those tiny, everyday conversations? I decided to find out. And what I discovered completely changed the way I looked at not only this phrase, but almost every small interaction in American life. One quiet Tuesday morning, after dropping my children off at school, I stopped at my favorite neighborhood coffee shop. It wasn't fancy. The tables were slightly scratched, the menu board had handwritten specials, and the same soft jazz playlist seemed to repeat every week. The barista already knew my order before I reached the counter. Good morning, she smiled. The usual? I nodded, smiled back, and thanked her. While waiting for my coffee, an older gentleman sitting near the window suddenly sneezed. Almost instantly, 3 different people responded at nearly the same time. Bless you. None of them knew each other. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody acted as if anything unusual had happened. Within seconds, everyone returned to reading, working, or chatting. The entire interaction lasted less than 5 seconds, yet it somehow made the room feel warmer. As I carried my coffee to a nearby table, I couldn't stop thinking about it. 3 strangers had acknowledged another person without expecting anything in return.
No introductions.
No long conversation.
No awkwardness.
Just a tiny moment of shared humanity. That was when I realized I had been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of wondering why Americans say, bless you, maybe I should have been asking what the phrase accomplishes today. Later that afternoon, I asked my husband the same question. He smiled because he knew I had entered one of my curious moods. There are lots of stories about where it started, he explained. Some people connect it to old religious traditions. Others mention historical beliefs about sneezing during dangerous illnesses centuries ago. Historians still debate some details. But honestly, most people today aren't thinking about medieval history when they say it. He laughed softly before adding, they're simply acknowledging another person. That answer sounded almost disappointingly simple, yet the more I observed daily life, the more accurate it seemed. Over the next several days, I started noticing a fascinating pattern. At my son's soccer practice, one father sneezed while setting up folding chairs. Parents nearby casually said, bless you, and immediately continued talking about the game. At the supermarket, a woman sneezed in the cereal aisle, and an elderly shopper smiled before offering the same familiar phrase. At the library, someone quietly sneezed while studying, and another visitor whispered, bless you, without interrupting the peaceful atmosphere. None of these people stopped for long conversations afterward. They simply recognized another person's presence for a brief moment. The words themselves were tiny, but the feeling behind them was surprisingly consistent. Psychologists who study social connection often describe how very small acts of acknowledgement can strengthen trust and create positive emotional experiences between people, even if they never meet again. These brief moments may seem insignificant individually, but together they help shape how welcoming a community feels. Looking back, I realized my own confidence hadn't grown because I mastered complicated English expressions. It grew because I began understanding the emotional purpose behind everyday language. Vocabulary tells people what you know. Kindness often tells people who you are. That realization quietly transformed the way I practiced English. Instead of memorizing endless lists of advanced words, I started paying attention to ordinary conversations around me. I listened to the greetings exchanged between neighbors walking their dogs. I noticed parents thanking teachers at school pickup. I watched customers wish cashiers a good afternoon before leaving. These weren't dramatic conversations worthy of a Hollywood movie. They were the invisible threads holding everyday life together. For someone learning English, they became some of the most valuable listening lessons imaginable because they reflected real American communication instead of textbook dialogues. One evening, while helping my daughter bake chocolate chip cookies, flour somehow ended up everywhere except inside the mixing bowl. We both laughed as she accidentally sneezed from breathing in a tiny cloud of flour. Without thinking, I smiled and said, "Bless you." She grinned, giggled, and immediately replied, "Thanks, Mom." We both continued baking as if nothing remarkable had happened. A few seconds later, I suddenly paused. Months earlier, those same two words had made my heart race. Now they had become completely natural. The phrase hadn't changed. I had. That moment reminded me of another important lesson supported by learning research. Experts often explain that the brain remembers language more effectively when words become attached to meaningful experiences instead of isolated. Memorization. In other words, people don't usually remember language because they studied it once. They remember it because they lived it. Every family dinner, every school event, every walk through the neighborhood quietly strengthened my understanding far more than repeating vocabulary lists ever could. Of course, I also learned something equally important. Not every American says, "Bless you."
Some families use it all the time.
Others rarely do. Different regions, backgrounds, and personal preferences shape everyday communication across the United States. That diversity became another valuable lesson. Culture isn't about following identical rules everywhere. It's about paying attention to the people around you, respecting differences, and responding with kindness. Once I understood that, I stopped worrying about saying exactly the perfect phrase every single time. I focused instead on being present. One afternoon, while waiting outside my children's school, another mother smiled at me and said something I'll never forget. "You always make people feel comfortable." I thanked her, but inside I almost laughed. If only she had known how terrified I once felt speaking even the simplest English phrases. Her compliment had nothing to do with grammar. It had everything to do with confidence that slowly grew through countless ordinary moments. Looking back now, I realize the phrase, "Bless you," never truly changed my life by itself. It simply opened the door to understanding something much bigger. Every culture has invisible expressions that carry care more than information. Every family develops little traditions that outsiders slowly learn through experience. And every relationship grows stronger when people stop trying to sound impressive and start trying to make each other feel seen. Still, I had no idea that my greatest lesson wasn't waiting inside a coffee shop, a grocery store, or even around our family dinner table. It was waiting inside my own marriage. Because one quiet conversation with my husband would reveal something about love, communication, and belonging that I had completely misunderstood from the very beginning. And once he said those words, I never looked at our everyday conversations the same way again. My husband explained everything. Have you ever spent weeks trying to understand a culture, only to realize the answer was sitting across the dinner table the entire time? That was exactly what happened to me. After all my quiet observations, after replaying embarrassing memories in my head, after watching strangers casually say, "Bless you," in coffee shops, parks, schools, and grocery stores, I still felt like one important piece of the puzzle was missing. I understood the words. I understood the habit. But I still didn't understand why such tiny moments felt so emotionally powerful. Then one ordinary evening, while doing something completely unremarkable, my husband explained it in a way that changed not only how I heard English, but also how I experienced family life in America. His explanation lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it quietly erased months of unnecessary anxiety that I had been carrying without realizing it. It happened after dinner on a rainy Thursday. The children had already gone upstairs to finish homework. Soft music was playing in the background, and the kitchen sink was full of dishes that somehow seemed to multiply every evening. My husband washed while I dried. We had done this routine hundreds of times before, usually talking about grocery lists, weekend plans, or funny things the kids had said during the day. But that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had been noticing lately. Finally, I looked at him and asked, "Can I ask you something strange?" He smiled immediately. Those are usually the best questions. I held a warm plate in my hands for a moment before speaking. Why do people here seem so comfortable using little phrases all day long? Bless you. Take care. Drive safe. Have a good one. None of them are long conversations, but somehow they make people smile. He turned off the faucet, dried his hands with a towel, and leaned against the kitchen counter. Instead of answering right away, he asked me a question. What do you think those phrases are trying to do? I thought about it for several seconds. Be polite? I guessed. He gently shook his head. Sometimes. But mostly they're small reminders that another person matters. His answer sounded almost too simple, yet he continued before I could respond. Think about our mornings, he said. Every day before I leave for work, you tell me to drive safely. You already know I understand traffic rules. You're not giving me driving instructions. I laughed because he was right. You're telling me something much bigger, he continued. You're saying, I hope you come home. That's why those little phrases matter. I suddenly became very quiet. I had never thought about it that way before. He picked up another plate and smiled. When someone says, bless you after a sneeze, most people aren't thinking about ancient traditions or history. They're simply acknowledging another person for a brief moment. It's almost like saying, I noticed you, and I hope you're okay. Somehow those words reached me more deeply than any explanation I had read or heard before. The phrase itself wasn't magical. The attention behind it was. That conversation stayed in my mind over the next several days. Once I started listening differently, I realized our own family spoke this emotional language all the time without noticing it. Every morning my daughter reminded her brother, don't forget your lunch. Every evening my son asked his grandmother, did you get home okay? Before bedtime, my husband always checked whether the doors were locked. Not because anyone expected danger, but because caring often hides inside ordinary routines. Even our simplest conversations carried quiet messages of love beneath the surface. Behavioral researchers have long suggested that healthy relationships are strengthened by frequent small positive interactions rather than occasional grand gestures alone. Tiny expressions of appreciation, encouragement, and attention gradually build emotional security over time. Looking back at my own marriage, I realized that our happiest memories were rarely expensive vacations or dramatic celebrations. They were ordinary evenings filled with tiny acts of kindness repeated again and again until they became part of who we were as a family. That realization also changed how I approached English practice. Instead of asking, "What's the most advanced phrase I can learn today?" I started asking, do people show care in everyday conversations? Suddenly, learning became much more enjoyable. During school pickup, I noticed parents saying, "See you tomorrow," with genuine warmth. At the neighborhood bakery, customers thanked employees by name. When neighbors passed each other while walking dogs, they often exchanged cheerful greetings even if they had only a minute to talk. None of these conversations required complicated vocabulary, yet they carried genuine human connection. One Saturday morning, my husband and I took the children to a local farmer's market. Fresh peaches, homemade bread, colorful flowers, and handmade soaps filled the little booths lining the street. While we were choosing tomatoes, an elderly vendor sneezed. Before I even realized what I was doing, I smiled naturally and said, "Bless you." He looked up, smiled warmly, and replied, "Thank you, dear." Then he handed my youngest child a small apple to taste. We chatted for another minute about gardening before continuing through the market. As we walked away, my husband quietly squeezed my hand.
See?
He whispered. That wasn't about perfect English. I smiled because I finally understood exactly what he meant. Interestingly, psychologists often explain that confidence grows through repeated successful experiences rather than waiting until fear disappears first. In other words, confidence usually follows action instead of preceding it. That perfectly described my journey. I hadn't waited until I felt fearless before speaking. I kept participating in small everyday conversations, and little by little, fear lost its grip. The phrase "bless you" became only one example of something much larger. Every small interaction quietly rewrote the story I had been telling myself about what communication really meant. One evening, while we were watching an old movie after the children had gone to bed, I asked my husband one final question. "Do you think people remember the words we say?" He smiled without taking his eyes off the television. "Sometimes," he answered. "But most of the time they remember how they felt while talking to you." That sentence settled into my heart with surprising force. Suddenly, years of worrying about sounding perfect felt much less important than making another person feel respected, comfortable, and welcome. Since then, I have noticed something almost funny. The more I stopped trying to impress people with my English, the more relaxed my conversations became. I laughed more. I listened better. I asked more questions. Ironically, my English improved faster after I stopped treating every conversation like an exam. Instead, each conversation became another chance to build a relationship. Looking back now, I can honestly say that my husband never gave me a formal lesson about American culture. He simply showed me how kindness sounds when it becomes part of everyday life. And once I understood that, I realized I had been chasing the wrong goal all along. Fluency wasn't just about speaking correctly. It was about connecting sincerely. But life has a remarkable way of testing whether we've truly learned a lesson. Because not long after that conversation, I faced a moment when my confidence suddenly disappeared again. This time, however, it wasn't because I forgot what to say. It was because I had to decide whether I truly believed everything I had just learned. I stopped chasing perfect English. What if the biggest obstacle to speaking English isn't your vocabulary, your accent, or your grammar, but a story you've been quietly telling yourself for years? I didn't realize I was carrying that invisible story until one ordinary afternoon nearly brought all my confidence crashing down again. After everything I had learned about kindness, belonging, and those tiny everyday expressions Americans use so naturally, I honestly believed I had finally moved past my fear. I thought the difficult part was over. Then a completely unexpected moment reminded me that confidence isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you choose again and again, especially on the days when your mind whispers that you're still not good enough. Ironically, that uncomfortable moment became the turning point that transformed not only the way I practiced English, but also the way I treated myself. It happened during a parents' volunteer event at my children's elementary school. The school gymnasium buzzed with conversations as families helped decorate for an upcoming community celebration. Folding tables were covered with colorful paper, balloons floated near the ceiling, children ran excitedly between activity stations, and teachers smiled while trying to organize what looked like cheerful chaos. I had volunteered many times before, so nothing felt unusual. I greeted familiar parents, chatted briefly with one of the teachers, and helped arrange decorations near the entrance. Everything was going smoothly until another volunteer asked me a simple question. Would you mind making the welcome announcement when everyone arrives? For a second, I thought she was joking. Me? Speaking into a microphone? In front of dozens of parents and children? My heart immediately began beating faster. The room hadn't changed. The people hadn't changed. Only the conversation inside my own mind had changed. Almost instantly, old thoughts rushed back. What if I pronounce something incorrectly? What if I forget a word? What if everyone notices my mistake? What if they smile politely, but secretly think I sound strange? It amazed me how quickly fear returned. Just a few days earlier, I had confidently chatted with strangers at the farmer's market. Yet now, faced with a microphone, my confidence seemed to disappear. I smiled awkwardly and almost said no. Almost. Then I remembered something my husband had said while we were washing dishes. People remember how they felt while talking to you, not whether every sentence was perfect. That sentence quietly interrupted the panic building inside my head. Around the same time, I also remembered reading about an interesting finding from cognitive psychology. Researchers have repeatedly found that perfectionism often increases anxiety while reducing performance. The harder people try to avoid every possible mistake, the more mental energy they spend monitoring themselves instead of focusing on the actual conversation. In simple words, fear steals attention. And when attention disappears, confidence usually follows. Standing there in the school gym, I realized I was doing exactly that. I wasn't thinking about welcoming families. I was thinking about protecting myself from embarrassment. Those are two completely different goals. One creates connection. The other creates fear. I took a slow breath, smiled, and surprised even myself. I'd be happy to help, I replied. The volunteer smiled warmly. Wonderful. Thank you. She handed me a small card with 3 simple sentences. Nothing complicated. Nothing difficult. Yet as I waited near the microphone, those 3 sentences suddenly looked much longer than they actually were. Children continued laughing nearby. Parents carried decorations across the room. Teachers checked attendance lists. Nobody seemed to be paying attention to me, except I believed everyone was. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect, the tendency to overestimate how much other people notice our actions and mistakes. Once again, I had fallen into the same mental trap. My brain had quietly convinced me that I was standing on a giant stage when, in reality, everyone was simply enjoying a busy afternoon. When the event coordinator nodded toward me, I walked to the microphone. For one brief second, the room felt completely silent. Then I smiled. Good afternoon, everyone. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. Thank you for being here today. We're so happy to spend this special afternoon together. A few parents smiled. Several children waved at friends. Someone in the back continued blowing up balloons. Life carried on. Nobody looked shocked. Nobody whispered. Nobody cared whether my accent sounded different. They cared that someone had welcomed them kindly. 30 seconds later, it was over. That was it. The terrifying moment my imagination had turned into a disaster lasted less than half a minute. As I stepped away from the microphone, another mother walked over and quietly said, "You have such a warm voice." I almost laughed. Not because she was wrong. Because if she had heard the conversation happening inside my head just 5 minutes earlier, she probably would have described me very differently. On the drive home, I kept thinking about something fascinating. My confidence hadn't appeared before I spoke. It appeared because I spoke. That small difference changed everything. From that day forward, I completely changed the way I practiced English. I stopped measuring success by perfect pronunciation. Instead, I measured success by participation. Did I join the conversation? Did I ask a question? Did I smile? Did I make someone else feel comfortable? If the answer was yes, then the conversation had already been successful. Interestingly, educational researchers have found that frequent low-pressure practice often produces stronger long-term language improvement than occasional high-pressure performance. That made perfect sense to me. Real life isn't one giant exam. It's thousands of tiny conversations happening every week. Greeting neighbors, talking with teachers, thanking cashiers, laughing with family, asking someone how their day is going. Those moments slowly build fluency in ways textbooks alone never can. My children unknowingly reinforced this lesson every single day. They never worried about sounding perfect before asking questions. They interrupted themselves, changed words halfway through sentences, laughed when they made mistakes, then immediately kept talking. Watching them reminded me that adults often lose something children naturally understand. Communication isn't a performance. It's participation. That evening, while we were eating dinner together, my son accidentally dropped his fork. Everyone laughed. He picked it up, smiled, and kept eating as though nothing unusual had happened. Children recover from tiny mistakes almost instantly. Adults often carry them for weeks. I suddenly realized I had been acting more like an anxious student than a curious human being. That realization felt incredibly freeing. From then on, whenever I caught myself chasing perfect English, I gently asked myself a different question. What matters more right now, sounding perfect or making someone feel welcome? Every single time, I already knew the answer. Looking back now, I honestly believe letting go of perfection improved my English more than any grammar workbook ever could. Not because grammar stopped mattering, but because fear stopped being in charge. And once fear lost its leadership role, curiosity finally had room to grow. Still, life had one final surprise waiting for me. A surprise so ordinary that most people would never even notice it. Yet that simple moment would quietly prove whether I had truly become part of the rhythm of everyday life around me. It would happen not at school, not at home, not during another family dinner, but in the most unexpected place of all. A neighborhood park, where two familiar words would leave me smiling for an entirely different reason. The day I finally said it naturally. Sometimes, the biggest victories in life don't arrive with applause. They don't come with trophies, dramatic music, or life-changing announcements. Sometimes they arrive so quietly that nobody notices except you. Mine happened on a bright Saturday afternoon in a neighborhood park, surrounded by children chasing bubbles, dogs running across fresh green grass, parents sipping coffee on wooden benches, and birds singing loudly enough to compete with the laughter around them. If someone had watched that afternoon from a distance, they would have seen nothing extraordinary. But inside my heart, something remarkable happened. Without realizing it, I crossed an invisible line I had been walking toward for months. And strangely enough, it all began with a single sneeze. Our family loved spending Saturday afternoons at the park whenever the weather was pleasant. My husband usually packed sandwiches while I prepared fruit, cookies, and bottles of water. The children raced ahead toward the playground before we even finished spreading out our picnic blanket. Everything about that afternoon felt wonderfully ordinary. Parents chatted while pushing strollers. Teenagers played basketball nearby. A group of grandparents sat under a large oak tree discussing baseball with the confidence of professional commentators. The entire park carried that familiar American weekend energy, busy but relaxed, filled with strangers who somehow shared the same peaceful rhythm. As I watched my children climb across the playground, I realized something surprising. Months earlier, places like this had made me feel nervous. Not because anyone had been unkind, but because public spaces meant unpredictable conversations. Someone might ask a question. Another parent might start chatting. A child could run over to say hello. Every interaction felt like an unexpected English test. Now, without noticing exactly when it had happened, that feeling had begun to disappear. I wasn't thinking about vocabulary anymore. I was thinking about people. That quiet shift changed everything. While my youngest daughter balanced carefully across a wooden bridge on the playground, she suddenly sneezed. Without the slightest hesitation, I smiled warmly and said, "Bless you." The words appeared naturally.
No rehearsal. No second-guessing.
No anxious voice inside my head asking whether I had pronounced them correctly. Just a simple, genuine response. My daughter smiled back. "Thanks, Mom." She immediately continued climbing as though nothing unusual had happened. For her, nothing had. For me, time almost seemed to pause. I had just done something that once felt impossible without even realizing it. Before I had time to think about it, another little surprise happened. A woman sitting on the next bench looked over, smiled kindly, and said, "Your daughter is fearless." I laughed. Most days she is. We both smiled. Then something interesting happened. Instead of ending there, our conversation naturally continued. She asked how old my children were. I asked whether her grandson enjoyed the playground. We talked about the unusually warm weather, the new walking trail nearby, and the best local place to buy homemade ice cream. Nothing complicated. Nothing impressive. Nothing that would ever appear in an advanced English textbook. Yet, 10 minutes later, we were still talking comfortably. As our children played together, I realized something almost unbelievable. At no point had I wondered whether my English sounded perfect. My attention had finally shifted completely away from myself. It rested where it belonged, on another human being. Psychologists often explain that meaningful conversations become easier when people focus outward instead of inward. Excessive self-monitoring increases anxiety, while genuine curiosity naturally reduces it. Looking back, I could almost see that principle unfolding in real time. Months earlier, every conversation had begun with the question, "How do I sound?" Now, it began with a completely different question. How is this person doing today? That tiny change quietly transformed everything. A few minutes later, the woman's grandson sneezed while running back toward the swings. Without missing a beat, 3 different parents nearby casually called out, "Bless you." The little boy laughed, shouted, "Thank you," over his shoulder, and kept running. Nobody paused. Nobody analyzed the situation. Nobody treated it like an important event. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Yet somehow it perfectly captured everything I had been learning. The phrase wasn't a performance. It was part of the rhythm of everyday kindness. As the afternoon continued, I noticed dozens of similar moments unfolding all around us. A father helped another family fold a stroller. Someone returned a lost baseball cap. A teenager held the park gate open for an elderly couple. Two children who had never met before shared sidewalk chalk without anyone asking them to. Tiny acts, tiny words, tiny smiles. Individually, they seemed almost invisible. Together, they created an atmosphere where people felt comfortable sharing the same space. Behavioral scientists sometimes describe this as pro-social behavior, small actions that strengthen cooperation and trust within a community. While each action may appear insignificant, repeated acts of everyday kindness gradually influence how safe, connected, and welcoming a place feels. Sitting there beneath the trees, I wasn't thinking about scientific terminology. I was simply watching it happen. At one point, my husband returned from the nearby food truck carrying lemonade for everyone. He handed me a cup and quietly asked, "You're smiling." I know. What happened? I think. I paused, trying to find the right words. I finally stopped translating life. He looked at me with a curious expression. What do you mean? I used to translate everything into English before I spoke. He nodded. Now I just respond. He smiled. I noticed. Those two words meant more to me than he probably realized. Because he had witnessed the entire journey, the nervous pauses, the overthinking, the embarrassment, the endless worrying about sounding natural. Now he was also witnessing something much better.
Peace.
On the drive home, our children fell asleep in the back seat after an afternoon of running, climbing, laughing, and collecting far too many little rocks they insisted were treasures. As I watched the quiet neighborhoods pass outside the window, another realization settled gently into my mind. Belonging doesn't arrive all at once. It grows. One conversation, one smile, one family dinner, one awkward mistake, one ordinary Saturday at a time. Later that evening, while unpacking the picnic basket, I remembered how frightened I had once been of saying two simple words. Now those same words carried no fear at all, only warmth, only habit, only care. Ironically, I had spent months believing English would help me belong. Instead, belonging had quietly helped my English. That discovery felt much bigger than vocabulary, much bigger than pronunciation, much bigger than grammar. Still, the most meaningful lesson of my journey hadn't come from strangers. It was waiting much closer to home. Because over the following months, I would discover that the people teaching me the most natural English every single day weren't teachers, neighbors, or even my husband. They were the two little voices laughing in the back seat of our car. And without realizing it, my own children were about to become the most unforgettable English coaches I could have ever asked for. Our marriage changed me. People often ask me a question that sounds simple but is surprisingly difficult to answer. What changed your English the most? Some expect me to mention a language app, a grammar book, or a special course. Others assume I practiced for hours every day. The truth is much less dramatic and much more meaningful. My biggest teacher wasn't a classroom. It wasn't even a dictionary. It was ordinary married life. Not because my husband corrected every sentence I spoke. In fact, he rarely corrected me at all. Instead, he quietly showed me something far more valuable. He showed me how language lives inside everyday love. Looking back now, I realize our marriage didn't simply improve my English. It completely changed the way I listened, the way I spoke, and even the way I understood what it truly means to belong. And the funny part is, I didn't notice any of it while it was happening. One ordinary Monday morning revealed this more clearly than any special occasion ever could. The alarm rang earlier than anyone wanted. My husband was searching for his car keys. One child couldn't find a homework folder. The other insisted that today absolutely required wearing the superhero socks that had mysteriously disappeared. Breakfast somehow became both peaceful and chaotic at exactly the same time. If you've ever lived in a busy family, you probably know that mornings often feel like a carefully organized tornado. Yet in the middle of all that movement, I noticed something fascinating. Nobody in our house spoke in long, perfect sentences. Communication happened through dozens of short expressions woven naturally into everyday routines. Good morning. Need any help? Watch your step. Don't forget your lunch. Drive safe. Love you. I'll see you tonight. None of those phrases sounded impressive. None required advanced vocabulary. But each one carried something invisible that textbooks rarely explain. They carried reassurance. They carried trust. They carried affection. Those tiny sentences quietly reminded every family member that someone was paying attention. As the front door closed behind my husband, I smiled without realizing why. Months earlier, I would have mentally translated each phrase, checking pronunciation and grammar inside my head before saying anything aloud. Now those expressions flowed almost automatically because they had become connected to real moments instead of language exercises. Somewhere along the journey, English had stopped feeling like something I performed. It had become part of the rhythm of our family. Later that afternoon, I picked up the children from school. During the drive home, my youngest excitedly described an art project involving glitter, glue, and what sounded like far more imagination than organization. Halfway through her story, she sneezed. Without hesitation, I smiled into the rearview mirror and said, "Bless you." My older child answered almost at the same time, "Bless you." Everyone laughed because we had spoken together. Then my youngest grinned and replied, "Thank you," before continuing her story exactly where she had stopped. The conversation didn't pause. Nobody analyzed the words. They simply belonged there, like opening a door for someone or waving goodbye. At that moment, I remembered how terrified I had once been of saying those same two words. The contrast made me laugh quietly to myself. Fear had once convinced me that such a small expression carried enormous pressure. Experience had revealed the opposite. The phrase mattered precisely because it wasn't complicated. It represented attention, not perfection. That evening, while preparing dinner, I asked my husband whether he had ever consciously noticed all the little expressions our family used every day. He thought for a moment before answering. "Not really," he admitted. "They've always just been part of life." His response fascinated me because it highlighted something I had slowly been discovering. Native speakers often don't notice the habits that make conversations feel warm and welcoming. They simply grow up surrounded by them. For someone learning English through daily life, however, those habits become valuable clues about how relationships are built one sentence at a time. Researchers studying family communication frequently suggest that healthy relationships are strengthened by repeated positive interactions that may seem ordinary on the surface. A kind greeting in the morning, a sincere thank you, a thoughtful goodbye, or a simple expression of concern can gradually increase feelings of emotional security over time. Listening to my own family, I realized we were creating those moments constantly without planning them. Every drive safe quietly meant, "I hope you return home." Every sleep well carried, "I care about your tomorrow." Every bless you gently acknowledged another person's presence. Once I recognized that pattern, I began noticing it everywhere. At the neighborhood grocery store, an employee smiled at an elderly customer and wished her a wonderful afternoon. At the public library, 2 volunteers greeted every visitor by name whenever possible. At my children's school, teachers ended conversations with parents by saying, "Take care," in a tone that sounded genuinely sincere rather than automatic. None of these interactions lasted very long. Yet each one left people smiling just a little more than before. I found myself listening not for difficult vocabulary, but for emotional intention. That simple shift made everyday English infinitely more interesting. One Friday evening, our family decided to make homemade pizza together. Flour somehow ended up on everyone's clothes. Cheese disappeared faster than it reached the dough because the children kept secretly eating it. At one point, my husband accidentally sprinkled too much flour into the air and immediately sneezed. Without even thinking, all three of us looked at him and cheerfully said, "Bless you," at exactly the same moment. He laughed so hard that he nearly dropped the bowl. "Well," he joked, "I definitely feel blessed now." The entire kitchen filled with laughter. It wasn't a remarkable event. In fact, if someone had walked past our house, they probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. But inside that kitchen, I suddenly understood something that had taken me months to learn. Belonging isn't usually created by extraordinary milestones. It's created by ordinary repetition, by hearing your name spoken with affection, by sharing dinner, by laughing at little accidents, by remembering someone's favorite dessert, by asking if they arrived home safely, by saying "bless you" without stopping to wonder whether your pronunciation is perfect. Educational psychologists often explain that meaningful repetition strengthens memory more effectively than isolated study sessions. Looking back, I realized that my best English practice had never been scheduled. It happened naturally while living, loving, cooking, laughing, shopping, driving, and raising children. Every ordinary day quietly became another lesson. That realization also freed me from something I hadn't noticed I was carrying. I stopped comparing my English to anyone else's. I no longer measured success by sounding like a native speaker. Instead, I measured it by something much simpler. Could I connect? Could I understand? Could I help someone feel comfortable? Those questions led to better conversations than perfection ever had. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house had finally become quiet, I looked around our living room and smiled. Months earlier, I had believed that belonging depended on saying the right words. Now I understood that the right heart usually finds the right words eventually. That lesson had changed my marriage in subtle ways, but it had also changed me. Still, one final surprise was waiting where I least expected it. Because the next people to teach me the most natural English expressions weren't adults at all. They were my own children. And they were about to correct me in the funniest, sweetest, and most unforgettable way imaginable. Our children became my best teachers. Here's something nobody warned me about. One day, your own children might become your greatest language teachers, and they probably won't even realize they're teaching you. I used to believe that parents were supposed to explain the world to their children. In many ways, that's true. We teach them how to tie their shoes, cross the street safely, treat others with kindness, and never leave dirty dishes under the bed. No matter how creative the hiding place seems. But somewhere between bedtime stories, school pickups, family dinners, and ordinary conversations, something unexpected happened in our home. My children quietly started teaching me. Not through formal lessons. Not by correcting grammar with a red pen. They taught me something much more valuable. They showed me what natural English sounds like when it grows out of love instead of pressure. And one unforgettable afternoon, they corrected me in a way that made our entire family laugh while teaching me a lesson I'll never forget. It happened after school on an ordinary Wednesday. The afternoon sun was pouring through the kitchen windows as I prepared apple slices and peanut butter for an after-school snack. My son rushed through the front door talking twice as fast as usual because he couldn't wait to tell us about a science experiment involving vinegar, baking soda, and what he proudly described as the coolest fake volcano ever. My daughter followed behind him, carrying an art project almost as large as she was. Within minutes, the kitchen was full of backpacks, water bottles, lunch boxes, unfinished stories, and the familiar sound of children trying to tell 3 different adventures at exactly the same time. Halfway through the excitement, my daughter suddenly sneezed. Without thinking, I smiled and said, "Bless you." She smiled back. "Thank you, Mom." Everything seemed completely normal. Then my son looked at me with the wonderfully honest expression that only children can wear. "Mom." "Yes?" "You always smile before you say it." I blinked. "I do?" He nodded very seriously. "Dad does too." I looked toward my husband, who had just walked into the kitchen carrying grocery bags.
He laughed. I guess veda.
My daughter joined the conversation.
It sounds nicer that way.
Her comment stayed with me, not because it corrected my English, because it reminded me that communication isn't only about words. Children notice things adults often miss. The smile, the tone, the pause, the warmth. Those invisible pieces matter just as much as vocabulary. That evening during dinner, I decided to ask the children a question. When someone says, "Bless you," what do you think it means? I expected simple answers. Instead, I received something much deeper.
My son shrugged.
It means somebody noticed. My daughter smiled. It means they care. My husband quietly looked at me across the table.
Neither of us said anything.
We didn't need to. The children had explained the entire lesson in only a few words. Researchers who study child development often observe that children learn social behaviors not only by listening, but by watching repeated examples. Every day, they absorb tone of voice, facial expressions, timing, and emotional responses long before they can explain why those behaviors matter. Listening to my own children, I realized something surprising. They hadn't learned "bless you" from memorizing vocabulary. They had learned it by experiencing kindness over and over again until it became part of how they naturally interacted with other people. The following weekend gave me another unforgettable example. Our family visited a neighborhood bookstore where the children's section always seemed to attract twice as many adults as kids. While my daughter searched for a new mystery novel, a little boy nearby sneezed loudly enough to make several people look up from their books. Almost immediately, my daughter smiled and quietly said, "Bless you." The little boy smiled. "Thanks." Then they both returned to looking at books as though nothing remarkable had happened. But something remarkable had happened. Nobody told her to say it. Nobody reminded her. Nobody rewarded her afterward. Kindness had become a habit. Watching that tiny moment filled me with unexpected emotion. Months earlier, I had worried so much about saying those 2 words correctly. Now my daughter used them naturally because, in her mind, they simply belonged wherever people cared about one another. As we walked toward the checkout counter, she slipped her small hand into mine. "Mom?" "Yes." "Why are you smiling?" I laughed softly. "I'm proud of you." She looked confused. "I only said bless you." Exactly. She had no idea how much that tiny sentence represented to me. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about another interesting discovery from educational psychology. Learning becomes much stronger when knowledge is connected to meaningful relationships instead of isolated facts. That perfectly described everything happening in our family. English wasn't living inside notebooks anymore. It was living inside birthday parties, bedtime routines, grocery shopping, homework conversations, weekend picnics, and ordinary afternoons filled with laughter. A few days later, something happened that made us all laugh again. My husband sneezed while fixing a loose kitchen cabinet. Before anyone else could speak, our daughter dramatically announced, bless you. Then our son added, double bless you. We all burst into laughter. Even my husband had to stop working because he couldn't stop laughing. It wasn't grammatically perfect. It wasn't supposed to be. It was joyful. Moments like that reminded me of something adults often forget. Language grows best where people feel safe enough to laugh. Psychologists have long noted that positive emotions can improve learning by increasing attention, flexibility, and memory. Looking back, I understood why my confidence had improved so much over the past months. Our home had become a place where mistakes weren't embarrassing. They were simply part of the conversation. If someone forgot a word, another family member helped. If someone mispronounced something, we smiled together instead of judging. If someone laughed at themselves first, everyone else relaxed too. That atmosphere quietly removed the fear that perfection had created. One evening before bedtime, my daughter hugged me and whispered, "Good night, Mom. Sleep well." I smiled. "You too." Then she looked back from the bedroom door and added something completely unexpected. "And if you sneeze tonight." She paused dramatically. "I'll still say bless you." The whole family laughed. As I turned off the kitchen lights later that evening, I realized my greatest lessons had never arrived through complicated conversations. They arrived through children who spoke from the heart, through ordinary family routines, through little expressions repeated with genuine affection until they became part of who we were. Ironically, the more naturally our family communicated, the less I worried about my English. And the less I worried, the better my English quietly became. By then, I no longer wondered whether I belonged. But one final question still remained. Did belonging happen because I had finally learned the language? Or had learning the language become easier because, without realizing it, I had already found my place? That answer would change the way I looked at my entire journey forever. What I want every learner to know, if you've stayed with me this far, there's something I want to tell you before this story comes to an end. It isn't a grammar rule. It isn't a secret pronunciation trick. And it definitely isn't another list of advanced vocabulary. It's something I wish someone had whispered to me much earlier. Long before I spent countless conversations worrying about every sentence that left my mouth. Because if I had understood this one lesson sooner, I would have enjoyed both my English journey and my everyday life much more. The surprising part is that this lesson didn't come from a teacher, a language course, or a best-selling book. It arrived through ordinary mornings, family dinners, neighborhood conversations, children's laughter, and one tiny phrase that once terrified me. Looking back now, I can honestly say that my biggest mistake was never speaking in perfect English. My biggest mistake was believing that perfect English was the price of belonging. For a long time, I quietly believed there were two different versions of myself. One version existed inside my mind. She knew what she wanted to say. She cared about people. She wanted to join conversations, tell stories, encourage friends, and laugh naturally with everyone around her. The other version appeared the moment English entered the conversation. Suddenly, she became cautious. She edited every sentence before speaking. She worried about pronunciation. She replayed conversations after they ended. She measured herself against people who had spent their entire lives speaking the language. It felt exhausting, even though nobody around me expected perfection except me. One afternoon, while waiting outside my children's school, I watched something that quietly changed the way I thought about communication forever. Two little boys were building a tower from large plastic blocks. They clearly disagreed about how the tower should look. One wanted it taller. The other wanted it wider. They interrupted each other, changed their minds halfway through sentences, invented words that probably existed only in their imaginations, laughed, accidentally knocked the entire tower over, and then immediately started building another one together. Watching them made me smile because neither child seemed remotely concerned about sounding perfect. Their only goal was understanding each other well enough to keep playing. That simple scene stayed with me. Adults often approach language as though every conversation is an examination. Children approach language as though every conversation is an adventure. Psychologists who study language development frequently point out that children improve because they actively communicate despite making countless mistakes. They receive feedback naturally, adjust, and continue participating. Adults, however, often delay participation until they feel ready. The irony is that readiness usually arrives after participation, not before it. I recognized myself immediately in that pattern. I had spent far too much time waiting for confidence instead of allowing confidence to grow through ordinary conversations. After realizing this, I made a small promise to myself. Every day, I would choose connection over perfection. Some days that meant chatting briefly with another parent while waiting outside school. Some days it meant thanking the cashier with genuine warmth instead of rushing away. Sometimes it meant asking a neighbor about their garden. Sometimes it meant smiling at someone walking their dog. None of those conversations changed the world, but together they quietly changed me. Educational researchers often describe language acquisition as something strengthened by meaningful repetition within authentic situations. In simple terms, the brain remembers language much more effectively when it becomes connected to real emotions, relationships, and experiences. Looking back, I finally understood why my progress had accelerated. I wasn't memorizing disconnected vocabulary anymore. I was collecting memories. Every family dinner became listening practice. Every grocery trip became speaking practice. Every school event became confidence practice. Every laugh became proof that communication had succeeded. One evening, my husband noticed me smiling while putting away groceries. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I laughed. I was just remembering how afraid I used to be of saying, "Bless you." He smiled immediately. "Hard to believe now." "It really is. You don't even think about it anymore." He was right. The phrase had become automatic. But more importantly, the fear had disappeared. Not because I had somehow become a perfect English speaker. Because I had stopped demanding perfection from myself. That difference changed everything. Around the same time, I began noticing something fascinating about conversations in our community. The people others described as easy to talk to weren't always the ones with the richest vocabulary. They were usually the people who listened carefully, smiled sincerely, remembered names, and made others feel comfortable. Communication researchers have consistently found that warmth, active listening, and genuine attention strongly influence how people experience conversations. That observation matched exactly what I had experienced throughout my own journey. Fluency certainly matters, but kindness often determines whether people enjoy talking with you. One Saturday morning at the local farmer's market, I experienced a moment that perfectly captured this lesson. An elderly woman accidentally dropped a small bag of peaches. Several rolled across the sidewalk before anyone could react. Without hesitation, 3 strangers bent down to help collect them. Someone handed her the bag. Another person checked whether any fruit had been damaged. She smiled gratefully and quietly said, "People are so kind here." As our family continued walking, I thought about her words. She hadn't praised anyone's vocabulary. She hadn't admired anyone's pronunciation. She remembered kindness. That afternoon, I asked my children another question. What makes someone nice to talk to? My son answered first. They listen. My daughter added, and they don't make you feel nervous. Children have an amazing ability to simplify truths adults often complicate. Later that evening, After the house had become quiet, I sat by the living room window thinking about everything that had happened over the past months. The awkward family dinner, the coffee shop, the neighborhood park, school events, weekend picnics. Tiny conversations that once felt intimidating had slowly become ordinary pieces of daily life. None of those moments looked dramatic while they were happening. Yet together, they completely changed my relationship with English. If someone asked me today for one piece of advice about learning English through everyday life, I wouldn't tell them to chase complicated expressions first. I'd tell them to notice people. Notice how friends greet each other. Notice how families encourage one another. Notice the little phrases that make everyday conversations warmer. Because language isn't only built from words. It's built from relationships. Looking back, I finally understand that the phrase "bless you" never became important because of its history. It became important because it taught me to pay attention to another person's needs, to another person's feelings, to another person's presence. And once I learned to pay attention, everything else became easier. Still, there was one final realization waiting for me. It arrived on an ordinary evening inside my own home, when I looked around the dinner table and suddenly understood that the greatest gift I had received wasn't better English at all. It was something far more valuable. It was the quiet certainty that, without even noticing exactly when it happened, I finally felt completely at home. The phrase that changed my heart. If someone had met me on the day I froze after hearing a simple sneeze, they probably would never believe the person I'm about to describe. They would have seen a woman quietly questioning every sentence before speaking. Someone who believed belonging depended on saying exactly the right words at exactly the right moment. They would never have guessed that months later, I would be laughing with my family around the dinner table, chatting comfortably with neighbors, greeting strangers at the farmer's market, and no longer noticing when I naturally said, "Bless you." The biggest surprise, however, wasn't that my English had improved. The biggest surprise was discovering that the person who changed the most wasn't the speaker. It was the listener. Somewhere along this journey, my ears changed before my voice did. And once that happened, everything else quietly followed. One peaceful autumn evening, our family gathered outside on the back porch after dinner. The air had turned cooler, the leaves were beginning to change color, and our children were busy trying to convince us that marshmallows somehow tasted better when toasted just a little too long. My husband laughed as he rescued one that had nearly fallen into the fire pit. It was one of those ordinary evenings that probably wouldn't seem important to anyone else.
No verstas. No holidays.
No special announcements. Just family, fresh air, and the comforting sound of everyone talking over one another in the happiest possible way. As I looked around, I noticed something I had completely overlooked before. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. My husband wasn't choosing sophisticated words. The children weren't speaking in perfect sentences. Even our conversations wandered from school stories to grocery shopping, from funny memories to weekend plans without any clear direction. Yet somehow, every person around that fire felt heard. That was when I understood something that had quietly been growing inside me all along. Real belonging doesn't sound perfect. It sounds comfortable. That realization reminded me of a conversation I had shared with one of my neighbors a few days earlier. We had met while bringing our trash bins back after collection day. It wasn't an important conversation. In fact, if someone had asked me exactly what we discussed, I probably couldn't have remembered every detail. We talked about the weather, an unusually beautiful sunset, and how quickly children seem to grow. Before we walked back toward our homes, she smiled warmly and said, "It's always nice talking with you." I thanked her and continued home without thinking much about it. But later that evening, her words returned to me. She hadn't complimented my English. She hadn't admired my vocabulary. She had simply enjoyed the conversation. That tiny difference meant everything. Communication researchers often explain that people usually evaluate conversations based less on technical perfection and more on emotional experience. Did they feel respected? Did they feel understood? Did they feel comfortable? Looking back, I realized those had quietly become my own priorities too. Instead of asking myself whether I had spoken flawlessly, I now asked whether the other person had felt welcome. That single shift transformed every conversation I had. One Saturday morning, our family volunteered at a neighborhood community cleanup event. Dozens of families gathered with gloves, trash bags, and plenty of cheerful energy. Children competed to see who could collect the most litter, while adults joked that they deserved medals for surviving early weekend mornings. As we worked together, I noticed how naturally people encouraged one another. Great job. Thanks for helping. Be careful. Need another bag? Simple phrases. Short sentences. Warm voices. None required advanced English. Yet together they created an atmosphere where complete strangers quickly felt like teammates. At one point, an older volunteer sneezed while lifting a recycling bin. Several voices immediately responded, "Bless you." He smiled, laughed softly, and replied, "Thank you, everybody." The group continued working without missing a beat. I smiled too. Not because the phrase surprised me anymore, because I suddenly realized I wasn't observing it as an outsider. I was participating. That quiet thought stayed with me for the rest of the day.
Participation.
Months earlier, I had focused almost entirely on performance. Did I sound correct? Did I choose the right words? Did I pronounce everything perfectly? Now those questions rarely entered my mind. Instead, I focused on sharing the moment with the people around me. Educational psychologists often describe learning as moving through different stages. At first, every action requires conscious effort. Over time, repeated meaningful experiences allow those actions to become automatic. Looking back across my own journey, I could clearly see that transformation. At first, every conversation felt like solving a puzzle. Later, conversations began feeling like conversations again. Perhaps the most meaningful moment came a few evenings later. Our family had just finished dinner when my youngest child accidentally knocked over a glass of water. For one brief second, everyone looked at the spreading puddle. Then something beautiful happened. Nobody became angry. Nobody blamed anyone. My husband calmly reached for a towel. Our son grabbed extra napkins. Our daughter apologized before anyone even asked. Within 30 seconds, the table was clean again. As we all sat back down, I couldn't stop smiling. Months earlier, I might have focused on the spilled water. Now I noticed something much more important. Everyone's first instinct had been helping, not criticizing. That small family moment reminded me of my own journey with English. Every time I stumbled over a word, the people who loved me had responded the same way. With patience. With encouragement. With kindness. Not once had anyone demanded perfection. I had been the only person making that demand. Later that night, while folding laundry, I asked my husband a question. When did you realize I stopped worrying so much? He smiled thoughtfully before answering. I don't think you stopped worrying all at once. So when? I think you slowly replaced fear with curiosity. His answer surprised me. Curiosity. He was right. Instead of wondering whether I would make mistakes, I had started wondering what I might learn from each conversation. That tiny change had quietly rewritten everything. Psychologists often explain that curiosity broadens attention while anxiety narrows it. Once fear stopped controlling my conversations, I naturally noticed more expressions, more humor, more emotion, and more opportunities to connect. English didn't become easier because the language changed. It became easier because my mindset changed. As I prepared for bed that evening, I found myself remembering the frightened woman from the beginning of the story. The woman who froze after hearing a sneeze. The woman who believed 2 tiny words could expose every weakness she imagined she had. I smiled gently at that memory, not because she had been foolish, because she had been trying so hard. And maybe that's the real lesson. Growth often begins long before we notice it. One kind conversation, one family dinner, one encouraging smile, one ordinary bless you. Those little moments quietly shape us until one day we wake up and realize we're no longer the same person. As I turned off the bedroom light, one final thought settled peacefully into my heart. This journey had never really been about mastering a phrase. It had been about discovering the kind of person I wanted to become every time I opened my mouth. And the most beautiful part was this. The story wasn't ending with better English. It was ending with a happier family, a more peaceful heart, and a deeper understanding that belonging is never earned by sounding perfect. It grows naturally wherever kindness is spoken often enough to become a way of life. Did one phrase make me belong? So, did one simple phrase really make me belong? If you had asked me that question on the day I froze after hearing someone sneeze, I probably would have answered yes without hesitation. At the time, those 2 little words seemed enormous. They felt like a secret password everyone else already knew. I believed that if I could only say them at the right moment, with the right pronunciation, in exactly the right way, everything would somehow fall into place. But now, after months of ordinary family dinners, quiet conversations, neighborhood walks, children's laughter, school events, grocery store greetings, and countless little moments that never appeared in any language textbook, my answer is completely different. No, one phrase did not make me belong. It simply opened my eyes to something that had been waiting for me all along. Belonging was never hidden inside the words. It was hidden inside the heart behind them. And once I understood that, I realized this story had never really been about English at all. A few evenings ago, our family gathered around the dinner table just as we have done hundreds of times before. The children excitedly shared stories from school. My husband described something funny that had happened at work. We laughed over a recipe that almost became a disaster because someone accidentally confused sugar with salt. The dog quietly waited under the table, convinced that patience would eventually be rewarded with dropped food. Nothing extraordinary happened.
No dramatic speeches.
No emotional music. No life-changing announcement. It was simply another ordinary evening. Then my son sneezed. Without thinking, everyone around the table smiled. Bless you. The words came from different voices at almost the same time. My son smiled. Thanks. The conversation immediately continued. No one paused. No one noticed. No one treated the moment as special, except me. For just a second, I looked around the table and felt something almost impossible to describe. Months earlier, I had believed this tiny phrase was a test. Now it had become a family habit. Not because anyone insisted on it. Not because anyone corrected each other. Simply because caring had quietly become part of our daily rhythm. That moment made me realize something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. The strongest traditions are often the quietest ones. Researchers who study family relationships often explain that emotional security grows through repeated, everyday interactions rather than occasional. Grand gestures alone. A warm greeting before work. A thank you after dinner. A hug before bedtime. A smile after someone sneezes. Individually, these moments appear almost insignificant. Together, they slowly create a home where people feel safe, valued, and understood. Looking around my own family that evening, I realized I had been living inside that lesson without fully recognizing it. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, my husband and I sat outside watching the stars appear one by one above the quiet neighborhood. The air was cool, the street was peaceful, and somewhere in the distance someone was walking a dog. After several minutes of comfortable silence, he asked me a question I wasn't expecting. If you could go back and talk to yourself on the day you were so worried about saying bless you, what would you tell her? I smiled before answering. I'd tell her to stop trying so hard to sound perfect. He nodded. What else? I'd tell her that kindness is remembered much longer than flawless grammar. He smiled. I think she'd believe you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I quietly added something I hadn't realized until that very second. I'd also tell her she's already enough. Those words surprised even me, not because they were dramatic, because they were finally true. For so long, I had measured myself against impossible standards that nobody else expected. Perfect pronunciation, perfect vocabulary, perfect timing, perfect confidence. Yet the people who loved me had never asked for perfection. They had simply wanted me to join the conversation. Behavioral psychologists often describe self-compassion as an important factor in long-term learning and resilience. People who respond to mistakes with patience rather than harsh self-criticism tend to remain engaged longer and recover more quickly from setbacks. Looking back across my own journey, I could clearly see that change. The day I stopped treating every mistake as evidence of failure was the day learning became enjoyable again. The following weekend, something wonderfully ordinary happened that quietly confirmed everything I had learned. Our family visited the same neighborhood park where I had once realized I could naturally say, bless you, without hesitation. Children were climbing, parents were chatting, dogs were happily chasing tennis balls across the grass. And the entire park carried that familiar feeling of relaxed community. As we walked along the path, an elderly gentleman sitting on a nearby bench sneezed. Before I could say anything, my daughter smiled warmly. Bless you. He looked up with kind eyes. Thank you, sweetheart. She smiled back. Then we continued walking. That was all. A 3-second conversation between two people who would probably never meet again. Yet somehow, it represented everything this journey had taught me. Language can begin a conversation. Kindness gives it meaning. As we reached the playground, my husband quietly slipped his hand into mine. You know what I noticed? He asked. What? You don't look nervous anymore. I laughed softly. I don't feel nervous anymore. He squeezed my hand gently. I know. That tiny exchange meant more than I can explain. Not because it proved my English had become perfect, but because it reminded me that fear no longer controlled the happiest parts of my life. Today, whenever someone asks me how they should practice English, my answer is always much simpler than they expect. Listen to real conversations. Notice everyday kindness. Pay attention to how people make each other feel. Learn the small expressions people naturally use with family, friends, neighbors, teachers, and strangers. Don't chase perfection so fiercely that you miss the people standing right in front of you. Because one day, almost without realizing it, those little conversations will become your own. And one day you'll smile after saying something that once frightened you. Not because you've memorized it, because you've lived it. If you've listened to my story from beginning to end, I hope you remember one thing whenever you hear someone say, bless you. Don't hear only 2 English words. Hear a tiny moment of human connection. A reminder that someone noticed another person. A reminder that kindness rarely needs complicated vocabulary. A reminder that belonging isn't something you earn by speaking perfectly. It's something that quietly grows every time you choose patience over fear, curiosity over embarrassment, and compassion over self-criticism. My journey didn't end with flawless English. It ended with a happier marriage, stronger family bonds, more confidence, and a heart that finally understood that the smallest words often carry the greatest warmth. And maybe that's the most beautiful lesson of all. Before you leave, let me ask you one final question. What if the sentence you've been afraid to say isn't the one that's holding you back? What if it's the fear of saying it at all? For months, I thought two simple words, bless you, would decide whether I belonged. But life quietly taught me something far more beautiful. People rarely remember your perfect grammar. They remember your smile. They remember your kindness. They remember how safe and welcome they felt when they were with you. So, the next time someone sneezes, don't just hear two English words. Hear an opportunity to connect, an opportunity to care, an opportunity to become just a little braver than you were yesterday. If today's story made you smile, reminded you of your own journey, or helped you feel a little more confident about learning English, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments, tell me this. What is one small English phrase that changed the way you see the world? I read your comments, and your stories often inspire future videos for this channel. If you're looking for slow English stories, real American culture, everyday conversations, listening practice, reading practice, and natural spoken English through heartfelt life experiences, you're in exactly the right place. Subscribe now because our next story begins with another tiny everyday expression that most Americans say without thinking, but almost nobody explains. Once you understand its hidden meaning, you'll never hear it the same way again. Until next time.
Take care.
Keep listening.
Keep speaking.
Keep believing that every small conversation is one more step toward confidence. And remember, sometimes the shortest English phrase can open the biggest door in your heart.